The train lurched forward with a groan of steel against steel, rattling the windows and stirring up a faint cloud of coal smoke that drifted through the narrow passenger car. Mary Whitfield sat stiffly on the wooden bench, hands folded tight, around a carpetbag that contained all her worldly possessions. Every clatter of the wheels against the track seemed to echo the pounding of her heart. She told herself she had chosen this path, that answering an advertisement for a husband in the Arizona Territory was better than the grim life she had left behind in Boston, but the tremor in her fingers betrayed the truth. She was terrified. The air inside the train smelled of soot, leather, and a faint hint of perfume from a well-dressed matron across the aisle. Mary felt out of place among the passengers. Some were families with wide-eyed children pointing excitedly out the windows. At the endless plains, others were men in dusty coats speaking loudly of ranches and cattle herds. And then there was her, a plain girl of 21, cloaked in modest gray, clutching the promise of a new life written in ink by a stranger's hand. She replayed the words of the advertisement she had answered months ago, a notice that had seemed both daring and desperate when she first read it. Frontiersman seeks God-fearing, virtuous wife to share homestead. Must be willing to endure hardship and embrace new life in the West. A church elder had arranged the correspondence, vouching for the man's honesty. His name was Thomas Hale. The letters he sent were brief, practical, and absent of endearment, but they held a steadiness that had called to her. Boston had never been kind to her. After her mother died, Mary had become little more than a servant in her uncle's house, tolerated only because she worked hard and asked for nothing. Suitors never came calling. She was quiet, timid, and unremarkable in the eyes of society. The thought of marriage had once seemed as distant as the stars. Yet when the chance came, though strange and frightening, it had felt like Providence opening a door. Now, as the miles stretched farther from the familiar cobblestones of the city, doubts pressed in on her. What sort of man awaited her at the end of this journey? Was he truly the steady, God-fearing soul she had imagined, or a hardened brute who saw a wife as little more than labor for his homestead? And even if he proved kind, could she bear the wildness of a land whispered about in fearful tones, raids, droughts, rattlesnakes, and endless isolation? Mary pressed her forehead to the glass, gazing at the vast prairie rolling endlessly beyond. The tracks. She had never seen so much sky. It stretched blue and merciless above a land that looked both beautiful and unforgiving. The wind bent the tall grasses in rippling waves, and lone hawks wheeled high above. She tried to draw courage from the sight, telling herself that God's creation was wide, and perhaps her place waited here, where no one yet knew her failings. The conductor passed through the car, calling out the next stop, and Mary startled. As though shaken from a dream, she reached into her bag and pulled out the worn envelope containing Thomas Hale's letters. She unfolded the first one, the one that had convinced her to board this train, and read it for the 100th time. I do not promise ease nor wealth, only a roof, food from my labor, and honesty between us. If you can be content with that, you will not lack care. There was no poetry, no declaration of affection. Yet beneath the spare words she sensed a man who valued truth, who did not dress promises in finery he could not provide. That steadiness, she reminded herself, was worth more than flattery. Still, her stomach knotted as the landscape grew rougher, the plains giving way to jagged hills and red earth. Each mile carried her deeper into a world she did not understand. She whispered prayers beneath her breath, asking for courage, for strength, for the heart of a wife who could endure what lay ahead. At the far end of the car, a child laughed, a bright, unburdened sound that made Mary's throat tighten. Would she ever hear such laughter in her new home? Or would silence and sorrow greet her, as cold and unyielding as the stare she had endured back east? The train whistle shrieked, long and mournful, as if echoing her own fears. Mary gripped her bag tighter, straightened her shoulders, and lifted her chin. She was a mail-order bride now, pledged to a man she had never seen. Whatever waited at the end of the line, she would meet it. Trembling, yes, but also determined. The stagecoach jolted over a rut, nearly pitching Mary against the side of the carriage. She clutched her carpetbag tighter, trying not to betray her nerves before the other passengers. They seemed accustomed to the wild roads and rough travel, laughing easily as dust poured in through the open windows. Mary, by contrast, sat rigid, every bump reminding her that with each passing mile, she drew nearer to the man she was expected to marry. His name, Thomas Hale, sounded strong in her mind, yet it carried weight like an anvil she was being asked to lift without knowing how. In Boston, people had whispered of him when her plans became known, not because they knew him personally, but because the type of man who sought a wife by post was often the subject of speculation. Rancher, trapper, soldier, such men lived hard, and hardness shaped them. When the coach stopped at a trading post to water the horses, Mary overheard two men at the counter speaking his name. She froze, her fingers tightening around her bag. "Hale?" One man said, lowering his voice. "A good worker, I'll grant him that. Runs stock like no one else this side of the San Pedro, but he's half stone, half shadow. Don't expect him to smile, not unless the world turns upside down." The other gave a grunt. "Lost his woman in an Apache raid. They say he's still. Carries the grief like a wound. Doesn't let anyone close." Mary's heart gave a painful twist. She had not known. In all his letters, Thomas Hale had spoken only of the land, of chores, of what he expected in a wife. He had not mentioned love nor loss. Yet now she pictured a man marked by sorrow, his heart buried with the woman he once cherished. Back in the coach, the words rang in her ears, half stone, half shadow. Was that to be her lot, marrying a man whose heart had hardened beyond repair? Could she warm him, or would she simply live beside him like two strangers bound by necessity? The thought of stepping into such a life chilled her, and yet, oddly, it did not break her resolve. For was her life in Boston any different? There, she had been invisible, laboring in her uncle's house without hope or affection. Perhaps even a stone-hearted man might be kinder than that dot as the day stretched into evening. The land outside shifted again, mountains rising jagged against a sky painted red and gold. Mary pressed her palm to the window pane, her breath fogging. The glass. Somewhere among those peaks and valleys waited Thomas Hale. She imagined him tall and broad, sun-darkened, with eyes that hid more than they revealed. She imagined hands calloused from rope and plow, shoulders bent beneath invisible burdens. When the coach rattled into the small town that marked her stop, Mary's stomach clenched so tightly she thought she might faint. The driver called out, "San Pedro crossing," and her fellow passengers gathered their things. One by one they stepped down into the dusty street. Mary lingered until last, her legs trembling as she descended the steps. The town was little more than a cluster of buildings, saloon, general store, blacksmith, and a scattering of clapboard houses. Cowboys lounged against posts, squinting into the fading sun. A dog barked, horses stamped, and women carried baskets across the street with hurried steps. Mary's eyes searched the crowd, heart hammering. Which of these men was her husband to be? Would he even come to meet her, or would she be left to find him on her own? She did not have to wonder long. A figure stood apart from the rest. Near the hitching post, a tall man with broad shoulders, his hat pulled low against the setting sun. His clothes were plain, his stance steady. But it was his stillness that struck her most. While the town bustled, he seemed carved out of the earth itself, unmoving, watchful. The driver tipped his hat toward him. "There's your man, miss, Thomas Hale." Mary's throat tightened. She could not yet see his eyes, but already she sensed the truth of the words she had overheard. Stone and shadow. A man who bore loss like armor. And she, a trembling virgin bride, was expected to become his wife. She swallowed hard, lifted her skirts, and stepped forward. Mary's shoes sank into the dust of the street as she forced her trembling legs to carry her toward the man who would be her husband. Each step seemed louder than the stagecoach's wheels, louder than the calls of the cowboys or the bark of the tethered dog. He turned as she approached, lifting his head just enough that the brim of his hat no longer shaded his eyes. They were gray clear, sharp, but heavy with something unspoken. Grief, she thought, and weariness. The kind of eyes that had seen more than they cared to remember. Miss Whitfield? His voice was deep, rough, as though he did not use it often. Managed a small nod, clutching her carpetbag in both hands like a shield. Yes, Mr. Hale? He tipped his hat once, a gesture more respectful than warm. Thomas'll do. No need for formality. You'll be weary from the road. Mary opened her mouth to answer, but found her throat too tight. Instead, she gave another small nod, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. She had imagined this moment 100 times during her journey, the meeting of eyes, the introduction, perhaps even a tentative smile. Yet the reality was so much starker. There was no smile, no easing of his gaze. Only a man studying her as one might study a weather front, measuring its strength, its endurance, its likelihood of holding. He reached for her bag. I'll take that. Mary hesitated, her fingers tightening around the handle. It was foolish there. Was nothing inside worth guarding except her letters and her one keepsake of her mother, a small locket. Yet surrendering it to him felt like surrendering the last piece of herself. After a moment, she let go, her hand brushing his calloused fingers in the exchange. Thank you, she whispered, though the words felt too thin. Thomas turned without reply and began striding toward the hitching post where a wagon waited. Mary followed, her skirts catching dust. People in the street watched openly, some with curiosity, others with pity. She could almost hear their thoughts. Another mail order. Bride. Poor girl. Does she know what she's in for? The wagon was plain but sturdy, the kind built for work rather than comfort. A pair of strong bay horses stood hitched, stamping the ground impatiently. Thomas set her bag in the back, then helped her onto the seat. His hand was firm but quick to withdraw, as though he feared lingering contact. Once seated beside him, Mary folded her hands in her lap, her eyes on the reins he held. She wanted to speak, to bridge the silence that yawned between them, but every phrase that rose in her mind seemed either too bold or too small. It was he who spoke first. It's a long ride to the homestead. You'll want to hold on. Roads rough in places. She clasped the edge of the seat as the wagon lurched forward. The town slipped away behind them, and soon the open land stretched on all sides red. Earth, thorny shrubs, distant mountains painted purple by the sinking sun. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the creak of wheels and the snort of horses. Mary stole a glance at him. His profile was stern, the set of his jaw unyielding, yet there was a quiet strength in the way he handled the reins. She thought of the words in his letter. I do not promise ease, nor wealth. Only a roof, food from my labor, and honesty between us. Looking at him now, she believed them. This was a man who would not offer more than he could give. Gathering courage, she asked softly, Do you live alone? His eyes flicked to hers, then back to the road. For a long moment he did not answer, and she feared she had overstepped. At last he said, Yes, just me, for now. The way he spoke those last two words, for now, sent a shiver through her. They were not tender, but neither were they dismissive. Instead, they held a weight, as though she were being asked to fill a space long left empty. Mary folded her hands tighter, whispering a prayer inside her heart. This was only the beginning, she reminded herself. First meetings were always uncertain. Perhaps in time, his silence would soften, his eyes would warm. Or perhaps she would learn to live with shadows. As the wagon carried her farther from everything she had known, she resolved one thing: she would not give in to fear. Whatever lay ahead, loneliness, hardship, or even the guarded heart of Thomas, Hale, she would face it. Trembling, yes, but determined. The wagon wheels ground to a halt just as the moon lifted above the horizon, casting silver light across the rugged land. Mary had never seen such stillness. No gas lamps, no clatter of carriages, no voices echoing from brick alleys. Only crickets, the distant yip of a coyote, and the groan of the horses as Thomas pulled them to a stop. "This is it," he said. Simply setting the brake. Mary followed his gaze. The cabin stood a little apart from a cluster of cottonwoods, its silhouette dark against the wide sky. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though she had not seen him tend a fire. A windmill creaked nearby, its blades slow, steady, patient. There was nothing grand about the homestead, no whitewashed porch, no garden fence, no cheerful lantern welcoming her home. It was practical, sturdy, built to withstand storms and solitude. Thomas hopped down and offered his hand. Mary took it, her feet finding the packed earth with a soft thud. She tilted her head back, studying the roofline, the shuttered windows. For a moment, dread pressed on her chest. Could this place so plain, so far from everything familiar, ever feel like home? He carried her bag up the steps and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, and a cool draft whispered out, carrying the scent of wood smoke, dust, and something faintly bitter, old ashes perhaps. Mary hesitated in the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Inside, the cabin was neat but silent. Every corner waited with stillness. A single lantern flickered on the table, casting long shadows on the walls. There was a stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with tin dishes, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The room looked more like a place someone passed through than a place they lived. Her gaze wandered and caught on a door half closed near the corner. Something about it tugged at her, though she could not say why. Thomas set her bag by the bed. "It isn't much," he said, his voice flat, "but it keeps out the wind. I'll add another quilt when the nights turn colder." Mary turned slowly, her fingers brushing the back of one chair. She wanted to thank him, to say she was grateful. But the words caught. It wasn't the sparseness that unsettled her. She had expected that. It was the emptiness, the way the air seemed heavy with things unsaid. Her eyes flicked again to the half-closed door. Before she could stop herself, she asked, "What's in there?" Thomas stiffened. For a moment, she thought he hadn't heard. Her. Then his jaw tightened. "Just a room." "Best you leave it be." Heat rose to her cheeks. "Of course." "Forgive me." He gave a brief nod and busied himself with the lantern, adjusting the wick though it needed no tending. His silence pressed against her like a wall. Mary folded her hands, uncertain whether to sit, to unpack, or to wait for instruction. At last he said, "I'll sleep in the loft. You'll have the bed." The words, though courteous, carried no warmth. She glanced toward the ladder leading upward to a small space under the rafters. The arrangement struck her as oddly distant, even for their first night. Yet she did not argue. "Thank you," she murmured. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into shadows broken only by the fire's glow in the stove. Then he climbed the ladder, his boots heavy on the rungs, and disappeared into the loft. Mary sat on the edge of the bed, her heart pounding. The silence grew deeper, settling into her bones. She loosened her bonnet, laid it across her bag, and let her eyes drift once more to the closed door. Something lay behind it, something that explained the hollowness of the house. The grief in Thomas's gaze. She drew the quilt around her shoulders and whispered a prayer. Lord, help me find my place here. Help me bring warmth where there is only shadow. Outside, the coyotes called again. Inside, the cabin listened, mute and waiting. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Mary had never known before. Morning began with the cry of roosters, the smell of wood smoke, and the endless expanse of sky spilling its colors over the land. She swept the cabin, prepared meals from simple stores, and tried to make herself useful without intruding on Thomas's work. He rose early, spoke little, and spent most of his time outdoors mending fences, tending the horses, and checking the cattle scattered across the grazing land. When they did share words, they were practical, never personal. More flour in the bin. Water barrels half low. Storms coming, keep the shutters closed. He was courteous, but he kept a distance between them. One Mary felt like a line drawn in chalk across the floor. She longed to step over it, yet something about his silence held her back. One afternoon, while Thomas was out riding the range, Mary gathered kindling near the edge of the cottonwoods. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that whispered of approaching dusk. She bent to pick up a branch when she heard a faint rustle, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing. She froze, heart quickening. Slowly, she turned her head toward the trees. At first, she saw nothing, only brush and shadow. Then, from behind the trunk of a cottonwood, two dark eyes peeked out, watchful, wary, belonging to a child. Mary's breath caught. The little figure stepped hesitantly into view. It was a girl, perhaps 6 or 7, with long black hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Her dress was worn, her bare feet dusty, and her face streaked with the marks of a hard life. Yet her gaze was steady, filled with a courage Mary herself did not feel. For a long moment, neither moved. Mary's heart pounded so hard she feared the child might hear it. She had heard of Apache children, but always in the fearful whispers of Eastern newspapers, tales of raids, of danger, of wildness. Yet there was nothing wild about the small figure before her. Only fragility. Mary lowered the bundle of kindling and, with deliberate slowness, crouched so she would not tower over the girl. Her voice came soft, uncertain. "Hello there." The girl did not answer at once. She shifted from one foot to the other, biting her lip. Then, in halting English, she whispered words that pierced Mary's soul. "Can you be Mama?" Mary's throat closed. She stared, struck silent, her heart twisting with such force it brought tears to her eyes. Of all the things she had expected in this wilderness, loneliness, toil, perhaps even danger, this was not one of them. A child looking at her with eyes so full of need, so full of longing, asking the one question Mary had never believed she would hear. Her lips trembled as she tried to answer. I don't," she swallowed, gathering herself. "Are you hungry, child? Would you like something to eat?" The girl nodded slowly, still watching her, as though weighing whether this stranger could be trusted. Mary held out her hand, palm up. "Come with me, then." The child hesitated, then edged closer, small fingers slipping into Mary's own. They were warm, fragile, and so achingly real that Mary felt a rush of protectiveness flood through her. Together, they walked back to the cabin. Mary set bread and a cup of milk on the table, watching as the girl ate with careful, silent hunger. She sat nearby, her hands folded tightly, afraid to break the spell. When Thomas returned, his boots heavy on the porch, he stopped short in the doorway. His eyes locked on the child, then flicked to Mary, his expression a mixture of shock and something darker, fear, perhaps, or grief. Mary rose quickly. She was near the trees. I thought she must be lost." Thomas's jaw tightened, the muscles working as if he held back words. He removed his hat, set it down slowly, and crossed the room. The child shrank a little but did not flee. His voice was low, gravelly. You weren't supposed to find her. Mary stared, her pulse racing. She asked me to be her mama. Silence fell, heavy and unyielding. The fire crackled in the stove. The child clutched her bread, her eyes darting. Between them, Mary's heart ached as she looked from Thomas to the little girl. Whatever shadows haunted this house, she knew one thing with sudden clarity. The emptiness she had felt since stepping through the cabin door was not born of solitude alone. It was born of secrets, and now those secrets had begun to speak. The silence after Mary's words seemed to stretch forever. Thomas stood rigid, his shoulders squared, his eyes fixed on the small girl who now sat at his table nibbling the crust of bread. The fire in the stove popped, sending sparks up the flue, but he did not move, did not speak. At last, Mary found her voice, though it trembled. "Thomas, who is she?" His jaw worked, as though grinding down words too heavy to be spoken. He reached for the back of the chair, his hand tightening on the wood until his knuckles whitened. "Finally," he said, in a voice flat and low, "her name is Lena." The girl lifted her eyes at the sound, wide and alert. "She's—" He drew in a sharp breath, then let it out slowly. "She's mine now, not by blood, but by promise." Mary blinked. "Yours?" Thomas nodded once, his gaze darkening with memory. "Her mother was my wife." The words struck like a hammer blow, each syllable heavy with pain. "She died 3 years ago when the Apache raided. Lena was left behind. No one came for her, and I couldn't leave her." Mary's heart gave a painful twist. His wife. The half-closed door. The grief she had sensed but never named. Suddenly the silence of the cabin, the emptiness of the rooms, all became clear. "But why?" Mary faltered, glancing at Lena, then back at him. "Why keep her hidden? Why not tell me?" Thomas's eyes flickered, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw not just hardness but vulnerability. He turned away, pacing toward the shuttered window. His voice was rough, torn from a place deep inside. "Because people talk. Because they look at her and see only what blood runs in her veins. To them she's the enemy's child. And to you?" He stopped, fists clenched. "To you, I feared she'd be a burden you hadn't chosen. I needed a wife who could endure this land. I didn't dare hope for one who could take Lena too." Mary swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with tears. She looked at the child, small, fragile, sitting quietly on the chair as though afraid to breathe too loudly. Lena's eyes were fixed on her, filled with a hope so fierce it broke Mary's heart. "Can you be Mama?" The whispered question rang again in her mind. She rose from her place and knelt beside the girl. Gently she brushed a crumb from Lena's chin. "She doesn't frighten me, Thomas," Mary said softly, though her voice trembled. "She needs someone. And she drew in a shaky breath. "I've been waiting all my life for someone to need me." The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile yet uncheckable. Thomas turned, his expression raw, stripped of its usual stone-like calm. For a moment, Mary thought he might speak, but instead he sank into the opposite chair, elbows braced on his knees, rubbing a hand across his face. "I've done my best," he muttered. "Fed her, clothed her. But I don't know how to give her what she asks. I can mend fences, fight off coyotes, endure storms. But when she looks at me and asks for a mama," his voice cracked, "I can't give her that." Mary's throat tightened. She took Lena's small hand in hers, feeling the warmth of the child's fragile trust. Then she lifted her eyes to Thomas. "Maybe you can't," she whispered, "but perhaps I can." For the first time, a flicker of light passed through his eyes, not joy, not yet, but something softer than grief. He studied her as though trying to measure the truth of her words. Lena leaned closer to Mary, resting her head against her shoulder. The weight of that tiny trust filled Mary with a fierce, surprising strength. She wrapped an arm around the child, her heart steady for the first time since she'd boarded the train. Thomas exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. "If you mean that, then maybe there's hope for this house after all." The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. The cabin no longer felt quite so hollow. Shadows still clung to its corners, but they no longer seemed unyielding. For in that moment, Mary holding Lena, Thomas watching with weary eyes, something new had been born, the fragile beginnings of a family. The days that followed unfolded differently than those first, hollow ones. The silence of the cabin was no longer absolute. It was broken now and then by the soft patter of Lena's bare feet across the floor, by her quiet laughter when Mary coaxed her into games with scraps of cloth and carved wooden animals, and by the rhythm of 3 voices instead of 2. Mary discovered that caring for a child required both patience and imagination. At first, Lena hardly spoke, answering questions with only nods or shakes of her head. She lingered at Mary's side like a shadow, always watching, testing whether this new woman truly meant to stay. But little by little, trust took root. One morning, as Mary kneaded dough at the table, she felt a tug at her skirt. Looking down, she saw Lena standing with a shy smile, a wildflower clutched in her hand. The bloom was crushed, the stem bent, yet Mary's throat tightened at the gift. She crouched, accepted it with both hands, and kissed the girl's brow. Lena's eyes widened, as if such tenderness were foreign to her, then softened with relief. Thomas witnessed it from the doorway, hat in hand. He said nothing, but Mary caught the way his gaze lingered, his features easing for the briefest moment. In the evenings, the 3 of them gathered by the fire. Mary mended clothes, Lena played at her feet, and Thomas sat with his hands clasped, listening more than speaking. Sometimes Mary told stories, fables her mother had once shared by lamplight. Lena leaned close, her dark eyes alight with wonder, while Thomas stared into the flames, as though the words stirred echoes he could not voice. It was not an easy path. The townsfolk soon noticed Lena's presence when Thomas brought Mary into San Pedro crossing for supplies. Whispers followed them through the general store, and Mary caught the wary glances cast toward the girl clinging to her skirt. One woman muttered under her breath, "Apache brat, loud enough to sting?" Mary's spine stiffened. She looked squarely at the woman and said with quiet firmness, "She is my daughter now, and I will thank you to remember it." The woman blanched, muttered something about minding her own business, and turned away. But the message had been sent. Mary's cheeks burned, yet inside she felt a surprising strength. Protecting Lena came as naturally as breathing. Later, as they rode home in the wagon, Thomas broke the silence. "You didn't have to speak up." "Yes," Mary replied, meeting his eyes. "I did." His hands tightened on the reins, then loosened. For a moment, his mouth twitched as though he might smile. It never quite formed, but she saw gratitude in his gaze, a flicker of light where once there had only been shadow. As summer deepened, the homestead itself seemed to change. Mary planted flowers by the cabin steps, splashes of color against the weathered wood. Lena helped, her laughter spilling across the yard when she accidentally dropped seeds into uneven piles. Even Thomas, returning from the range, paused to watch them work, the corners of his eyes softening. One night, after Lena had fallen asleep curled in her blanket, Thomas lingered at the table while Mary tidied the dishes. The fire cast his face in gold and shadow. At last he spoke, his voice low. "I never thought I'd see her laugh again." Mary set down the dishcloth, her hands still. She only needed someone to see her. His gaze lifted to hers, steady, searching for a heartbeat. The room felt charged, as though something fragile and unspoken hovered between them. Then he pushed back his chair and stood. You've done more than I ever could." Mary wanted to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, her chest warm with a mixture of sorrow and hope. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls Thomas had built began to crack. He still carried grief like a scar carved into his soul, but when he looked at Lena and at Mary, his eyes no longer held only shadows. They carried the faintest glimmer of healing, and Mary, once a trembling bride, began to feel something stir in her own heart. Not just duty, not just resolve, but the first, uncertain seed of belonging. Autumn painted the land in gold and russet, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Mary had been at the homestead for nearly 3 months, yet sometimes she still woke startled, half expecting to hear her uncle's voice calling her to chores in Boston. Instead, the first sound she always heard was Lena's soft breathing beside her or the muffled thud of Thomas's boots as he descended from the loft. Slowly, the rhythms of this life had become her own. The cabin no longer felt hollow. Flowers bloomed in the yard, Lena's drawings were pinned above the table, and the sound of laughter, hesitant at first, then freer, filled the evenings. Even Thomas's silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of stone, but the quiet presence of a man learning to live again. One chilly morning, while frost still clung to the grasses, Mary found Thomas repairing a hinge on the barn door. She carried a basket of mended clothes, but lingered instead of passing by. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his arms corded with muscle, his movements steady and sure. She realized then how much she had come to trust the strength of those hands, not only for the work they did, but for the steadiness they promised. "Thomas," she said softly. He looked up, pushing back his hat. "Emmem?" She hesitated, twisting the edge of her apron. "Do you ever regret it? Sending for me, I mean?" He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes, always so guarded, held hers. For a long moment he said nothing, and she feared she had asked too much. Then, quietly, he replied, "I regret only that I waited so long." The words struck deeper than any declaration of love. Heat rushed to her cheeks, but before she could answer, Lena's voice called from the cabin. "Mama, come see." Mary turned sharply. The word mama still startled her every time. It had taken weeks of cautious closeness, of shared stories and gentle reassurances, before Lena had dared to speak it aloud. The first time she had whispered it, Mary had nearly wept. Now it rang across the yard, sure and unafraid. She hurried, inside, Thomas following. Lena stood proudly by the table where she had arranged a small bouquet of wildflowers in Mary's chipped teacup. "For you, Mama," she said, her smile wide and unguarded. Mary gathered the child into her arms, holding her close. "They're beautiful, darling." Her voice trembled, thick with emotion. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching, his face shadowed by the morning light. Slowly, almost shyly, he stepped forward and placed a hand on Lena's dark hair. The girl looked up at him, her smile widening, then nestled against both of them for a heartbeat. The three of them stood together, Mary with her arms around the child, Thomas's hand resting gently over both. Something shifted then, subtle, but profound. It was no longer simply a house of necessity, a contract of survival. It was a home. That night, after Lena had fallen asleep, Mary sat by the fire mending a tear in Thomas's shirt. He watched her from across the table, his face softened by firelight. "You've given her what I couldn't," he said quietly. Mary looked up, startled. "We've given her together." He shook his head. "I could feed her, keep her safe. But it was you who gave her back her laughter. You who gave her the word Mama." His voice dropped. "And you gave me more than I thought I'd ever have again." Her needle stilled in her hand. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Slowly Thomas reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. Mary's breath caught, her heart racing, but she did not pull away. Instead, she turned her palm into his, feeling the warmth of his touch seep into her bones. For they kenned their bones. First time since she had left Boston, she no longer trembled. She belonged. The fire glowed, Lena slept peacefully in the corner, and the three of them, once broken by grief, fear, and loneliness, had begun to weave themselves together into something new. Not perfect, not without shadows, but strong. A family.